Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Lewin, CEO of the Computer History Museum. I hope everyone is well and safe. Today, I'm pleased to welcome you to our virtual event focused on the timely and important question about AI. Should we fear AI? We've convened a panel of experts from the tech and media companies, research organizations, and NGOs for a conversation with each other tonight in our format. So we appreciate you coming. Our programs are made possible through the generosity of our members and donors, and today we need your support more than ever to sustain the museum and delivering our new mission, which is to decode technology for everyone, its computing past, the digital present, and the future impact on humanity. And here to introduce today's program is Marguerite Gong Hancock, the museum's VP of Innovation. Marguerite?
Thanks so much, Daniel, and I'm really thrilled to add my warm welcome to each of you. Today, we continue CHM's ongoing focus on AI and innovation through a fresh exploration of AI's history, some of the issues for today, and as well as the choices that we face as digital citizens and their future implications for all of us. Before AI began to change our world for better or worse, an eclectic group of idealistic academics from around the globe spent decades trying to build neural networks, often in the face of enormous skepticism. As their ideas came of age and began to power everything from talking digital assistants to self-driving cars and automated healthcare, they were pulled into a world they didn't expect, along with the rest of us. In his newly released book, Genius Makers, The Mavericks Who Brought AI to Google, Facebook, and the World, New York Times reporter Cade Metz uncovers this tale. After reading the book, I think it's an intimate, surprising, and often dramatic telling of this history. And he's here today to explore these stories and also address questions such as, what are some of the untold stories that reveal the tapestry of the key people, the communities, and companies shaping the evolution of AI? What's driving the often strong conflicts between national interest, shareholder value, the pursuit of tech innovation, and the very human concerns about privacy, security, bias, and prejudice? How are these decisions being made, and who's benefiting? It's my pleasure to welcome Cade to CHM Live. Cade draws on his rich experience as a senior staff writer with Wired magazine and the U.S. editor of the Register, the British science and technology news site. He's now based in San Francisco Bay Area, where he's a technology correspondent with the New York Times, and he covers AI, driverless cars, robotics, virtual reality, and other emerging areas. As is tradition, here are his 5 numbers. 9 years covering AI, $44 million that Google paid for Jeff Hinton, 37, the move when AlphaGo eclipsed humanity, 80 photos of a Black woman tagged as a gorilla by Google, and 1 book to the whole story in his newly recently booked Genius Makers. Welcome, Cade. Now it's my pleasure. Welcome, Cade. Now it's my pleasure to welcome to CHM Live for the first time Daniela Hernandez, our moderator for today's program. Daniela is a digital science editor for the Wall Street Journal. While at the Journal, she's written about AI across multiple industries spanning from healthcare and financial services. Before joining the Journal, she wrote for Wired and Kaiser Health News. She holds a PhD in neurobiology from Columbia University. So glad you're here with us, Daniela. Daniela and Cade. Yeah, so glad to have you both here. We look forward to your conversation. Take it away.
Thanks. Cade, so nice to see you again. It's been, gosh, maybe like 16, 18 months since we last hung out in San Francisco. We go way back, and it's nice to reconnect over the AI beat, which is dear to our hearts. So you write in the book that this is a story that is fundamentally about people. People who were toiling in labs in obscurity, maligned and mocked for some of their ideas. What captivated you the most about this cast of characters?
Well, there were 2 moments, I think, that really inspired the book. The first was when I was in the Four Seasons Hotel in Seoul, South Korea. Marguerite, with those 5 numbers, alluded to this event where a lab called DeepMind which was based in London and had been bought by Google, built this machine to play the ancient game of Go, which is what they often call the Eastern version of chess, except it's exponentially more complicated. And most people thought, whether they were Go players or they were AI experts, they thought that a machine that could beat the best players of the game of Go was still decades away. But in 2016, this machine built by DeepMind actually beat one of the world's top players. And I was lucky enough to be there at the Four Seasons Hotel in Seoul. And there was this moment when I realized that the people who had built this machine, who had spent years kind of cultivating the ideas behind it and building this machine, could not understand what the machine was doing. They, like everyone else, was amazed and in some ways confused and caught unawares by this machine. And these individual people, including Demis Hassabis, who is, for the most part, the leader of this lab, became the focus of this book. I knew that Demis would be a character, but then I met Jeff Hinton, who is a generation older than Demis, and he became the central thread. He, in his own way, is a fascinating character and had worked on many of the same ideas as Demis and Demis's colleagues for decades. And for anyone who knows Jeff, he is a fascinating, engaging, strange character who has endured, serious hardship over the years, among other things. And I thought to myself, if I can just get Jeff onto the page, maybe this book will work.
I actually wanted to ask you about a moment about Jeff, who, as you say, is kind of this connector, the connector of this group. He is almost like the protagonist of your book. About halfway through, during the chapter that delves into the medical use cases of AI, there's a small scene in which Jeff lets out a small sigh, and he says that early diagnosis is not a trivial problem, that we can do better, and so why not let machines help us? And you write that there's this, that this was specifically really important to him because of his wife's experience with pancreatic cancer. That moment comes back at the end of the book, where he's at this party where he's being celebrated, but you see him immersed in this note card. Can you tell us about that moment?
Those, I love that you pinpoint those. Those are two very human moments. And you see, in the emotion that Jeff shows in both those moments, that sigh he lets out, and then the moment when he receives the Turing Award, and he doesn't talk about himself. He talks about his wife. And those are the kind of moments that I really wanted to capture. And the reason those particular moments are so important is that it shows the personal struggle that Jeff faced to bring these ideas to the fore. And it's just part of his personal struggle, but certainly like the most powerful. I think particularly at the end when he talks about his wife. But this is someone who had two wives, by the way, die of cancer. And at the same time experience his own physical hardship. As you learn in the first sentence of the book, he is someone who literally does not sit down because of a back problem. And this plays into the story as well, that he, in the face of this extreme back problem, he's got to make these pilgrimages across North America and sometimes across the Atlantic, remarkably. Maybe we can get to that. To realize these ideas. Those are the types of moments that I feel show, not only what he faces, but people like him often face when they're trying to kind of realize their work. There are technical problems that need to be overcome, and there are personal obstacles that have to be overcome as well.
Yeah, I felt the humanity in some sections of the book just jump off the page. You got a sense that some, like Jeff, were really loving, but sometimes struggled in how to say that. Lots of jokes, humor as almost a deflective mechanism. Others were a little more aggressive or adamant about their ideas in ways that captured a little bit of their insecurity, just reminded everybody that even though they're mavericks, like there's a humanity there, right? And so as you talked to other people for the book, how did their lives or loves, dreams, opportunities, and obstacles affect the way that they approach their work?
Well, what I loved is that it was different for each person. We're talking about essentially a single idea, this idea of a neural network, which dates back to the 50s, and it's about all these different people trying to push the idea forward, and their motivations and the way that they dealt with it were so different because they are humans, right? We are all different, and and those personalities come out in so many different ways. You're right. Sometimes it's humor. Jeff is an incredibly funny person as well, and I like how that humor would attract those around him as he's struggling to get this idea out. He needs the help of others, and you're right. That humor is not only entertaining, but it's a way of convincing people to work on this project. And as I got to know Jeff, but more importantly, as I interviewed his students who knew him well, you saw him as this magnet, often driven by that humor, but for other reasons, would draw people to him and help him realize this idea. You're right. There are other people who push this idea forward in other ways, right? Some people are so adamant about their idea, and they're so upset by the obstacles that they really lash out, right? And you see that as well, and that can work in some ways, and it can backfire in others. What I wanted to do is show all of that, and also how as these folks push this idea forward, it would behave in ways they didn't expect, especially as it moved into these companies, and surprise even them. And they reach these moments where they don't necessarily know what to do. That's part of it as well.
What surprised people like Jeff, like Jan, like Andrew Ng about the way that their technology caught on, but also was let loose for the rest of us to experience?
The great example, and we keep going back to Hinton, but it's almost inevitable, right? The great example is that Hinton, who was born in London, eventually made his way to the United States and started to explore this neural network idea, first on the West Coast, and then as a professor at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. There's this moment in the mid-'80s where Jeff and his wife at the time realized that he cannot do this AI work without taking money from Ronald Reagan's Defense Department. And that's not something that he wants to do, right? It's at the height of the Iran-Contra affair. He and his wife have very firm beliefs on this, but also fundamentally, they don't want this work to be used inside the military. So they actually leave the country. He believes in this stance to the point where he goes to Canada and sets up shop at the University of Toronto as a professor. And it would have real implications for the whole field years on when this idea finally started to work, right? Most of the talent was centered around Jeff and others in Canada, and it was not in the US. But as that idea starts to work and Jeff is sucked into Google, in short order, Google starts to work with the Defense Department. And there's this big protest at the company. There are some people who believe this is absolutely the right thing for Google to do. There are others who are really upset by it. They didn't expect to be working for a defense contractor. And there's a moment where Jeff himself struggles, with this. He was against it, but in working for this company, he wasn't sure how much he should speak out. He ended up lobbying Sergey Brin, one of the founders, to push back on this. But he wasn't as public with his concerns as some others. And there's a moment where, where there's a Google ex-Google employee who criticizes him for that. Again, you feel the humanity of the situation. All of us can relate on some level to, having our own beliefs on the one hand, and then having the motivations of our company, who we work for and supplies our paycheck on the other. How do you balance those? It's a hard thing.
I want to go back to, since we're on the topic of the military, AI has a long history of being funded by the military. Can you talk a little bit about that? It goes way back to the inception of deep learning neural networks.
It really does. And I think this is important for Silicon Valley writ large to remember, right? We're at this moment where we often see news stories that say, Silicon Valley is opposed to working with the military. And there's certainly a portion of the Valley that believes that. But the Valley, in many ways, was built on military money. Google was built on Defense Department funding. The internet, came out of a DoD project. The founders of HP, worked in Nixon's cabinet, with the Defense Department. And so there is this mixed history. Yes, Silicon Valley is largely a liberal place, and there have been times, particularly in recent years, where there have been protests for that kind of work. But that's only one side of the equation. And I think it's a good way of thinking about this technology that I write about, not only when it comes to military use, but all sorts of uses. That there are what they call dual uses for this technology, meaning it can be used for good, it can be used for ill, it can be used in many ways that you might not expect. And a lot of it is about point of view. And it's about all of us kind of struggling to figure out what is right and what's wrong. It's not always black and white.
The framing, I think, is really important here too, right? And I think going back to that first moment that you mentioned earlier in our conversation with Demis in Korea, where there's this national excitement about Go, right? Which is like chess and like Dota and some of the other games where AIs are trained and where they beat us. They're war games, they're violent games. Why are those the games of choice?
Well, it's interesting. They're the games of choice because they're hard, right? I think it's as simple as that they're chosen for technical reasons. They're chosen for historical reasons. And it's about the conquest, right? That's a real thing. And you can see this in Demis, right? In the book, he himself is fundamentally a game player. And, games are about competition, right? They're metaphors often for war. And the intensity of Demis's ambition is palpable. Like you could feel it in Korea. He wants to win, right? And that's really what drives him, as well as kind of the technological aspects of this. But the other thing is that games are something that we all relate to, and I think there's a reason that people woke up to the gains in AI when that Go event happened, right? All of us play games as well as children, and we can understand on some level the way games work, right? There's a winner and there's a loser, and the idea of a machine beating us is not only interesting, but it is scary. And you talk about the excitement in Korea. It was palpable. What I often say, because it's true, is that's one of the most amazing weeks I've ever experienced. And I wasn't even a participant. I was just an observer. You could feel the excitement of an entire country, because Go is a national game in Korea, focused on this. But you could also feel the sadness when Lee Sedol, who is the Korean very human player who is getting beat, you could feel the sadness envelop the country, and that fear and the concern, right? It really brought out those emotions, and that's why that was such an inflection point. But you're right, there's a dark side to this as well as a light.
Yeah, one of the things that I found particularly interesting about the stories in this book, about the people stories, was that there was this quest to improve upon our humanity, almost like we're like an outdated PC. Where does that come from?
Yeah, I mean, my father was an engineer, and we talked about this a lot. It's very easy when you're focused on the technology to see it as somehow separate from humanity. That's an attitude that you see in Silicon Valley often. That the technology is sort of boxed off from everything else is happening, and when you do that, it's easy to see it only for the positive things it's going to bring, and to not see all the other consequences and effects of this. I think what we really need to do, and this is part of what I wanted to do with the second half of the book in particular, is show that any technology is bigger than itself, right? It is about how it weaves into the rest of our lives. Anyone who's lived over the past 4 years can recognize that we have relatively simple technologies. Facebook is not a complicated technology, for instance, but it has huge effects because we all use it. These technologies that I'm writing about in the book are far more complex, in part because, and this get back to your first question, and the way I answered it is that we don't really understand how these things are operating in some cases. They literally learn skills on their own by analyzing data, more data than we can ever wrap our heads around. That means they're going to do things we don't expect. As those technologies get more powerful and more pervasive, their effect on our world is going to be greater than these relatively simple technologies we use today.
Going deep into the future here, from an audience question, based on what you learned on writing this book, do you think machines will have greater than human level general intelligence within the next 25 years? Please explain what you think about that.
Yeah, so the book goes into this, right? And what I do want to do in the book, as well as in a conversation like this, is make a clear distinction between the technologies of today and this idea that we're going to have a machine that can do anything the human brain can do, right? Sometimes scientists call it AGI, artificial general intelligence. That is still something that we do not know how to get to, right? We have two labs now who say that this is their stated mission. DeepMind is one in London, OpenAI is another in San Francisco. In their charter, it says we are building this. But they, including Demis, who is in this camp, don't necessarily know how to get there. It's aspirational. It's in the future, and because of that, it is really hard to say when we might get there. But this is not certainly a near-term thing. We have systems that can learn specific skills. We're talking about a machine that can recognize the words you say, or recognize faces and other objects in photos. And that kind of image recognition can help us build self-driving cars, other forms of robotics that can respond to some situations. It can help in healthcare, an area well. But that is different from a machine that can really reason. And that's one of the reasons self-driving cars are not on the road yet, right? They can't deal with all the chaos and the uncertainty that we as humans can deal with. So, I don't like to make a call on this because it's impossible, right? It is in the future, and people are going to argue about it. It can be fun to argue about when that's going to happen, but it's not going to happen soon.
The DeepMind labs, they're chock full of neuroscientists. Some actually went to grad school with me. And I think they would be among the first to tell you that we, as a neuroscience field, don't understand intelligence, real intelligence. How do you recreate something that you don't understand?
See, this is why I always liked working with you in years past. This is the key thing to understand, right? And it might not be obvious when you read stories about AI. We do not understand how the brain works. Therefore, recreating the brain is all from the get-go. It is a task that is harder than you might think. The brain is such a mysterious thing, but what you do see is that it provides a certain inspiration to the field. And you see this in Jeff Hinton, right? He was inspired as a student at Cambridge, by the idea that you could recreate the brain. And in, really nurturing this idea of a neural network, he's really, he's driven by this notion that he can take the loose way the brain works and apply that to machines. Demis now at DeepMind is taking that to another level, right? He does have a team of neuroscientists who study the brain and the way that the brain works and how that might be recreated. Some people like Demis and Jeff see this as kind of a virtuous circle, right? Where as you better understand the way the brain works, that can help you build machines that work like it. And as the machines improve and you figure out ways that they can mimic human behavior, that can help you in understanding the brain. That works sometimes, but not always.
Another question from our audience. Let's see here. Kate says modern social media are simpler than deep learning based AI. But modern search and social media also incorporate an enormous amount of AI and have done so for a long time. Can we talk about the impact of AI on communication in the online world?
Oh, absolutely, right. And this is another problem with the AI field. You have to sort of define your terms, right? AI is a term that dates back to the 50s and it gets applied to everything. And what I meant by simpler is that the algorithms that are, say, choosing what's in your social media feed are relatively simple compared to these neural network style systems. And the reason they're more complicated is that they do learn their tasks in this really intense way. The example I always use to sort of set the conversation is you take thousands of cat photos and you feed it into this neural network, which is just a mathematical system. And this neural network analyzes all those photos and looks for patterns that define what a cat looks like. That's how it learns to identify a cat. But we as humans can't really understand everything it is learning. Okay, and that's one thing with a cat photo. Now think about medical images. These systems learn the same way when it comes to medical images. We don't see the flaws in those systems. We don't know the mistakes that they're learning. Now apply that to the internet, which the person who asked the question alluded to. These systems learn from everything we've posted to the internet, all the texts, books, Wikipedia articles, all sorts of other stuff. We all know that the internet can be biased, for instance, against women and people of color. It can, we have hate speech, needless to say, on the internet. And these giant systems, which are learning natural language now, systems that help drive the Google search engine, are starting to be used in chatbots that are designed to carry on a conversation. They're learning those biases and those flaws. And by the way, other things that we may not see, even the creators of this technology may not see because of the way the systems are built.
You alluded to the bias that maybe inadvertently these systems might be escalating or promoting at scale. About 2/3 of the way into the book, we come to the chapters that deal with these very issues, and you have a prescient quote from Meg Mitchell from an interview I think she gave to Bloomberg, if I'm not mistaken, warning about the sea of dudes problem. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. That quote is interesting on many levels, one of which is it came so early, right? Another scene in that chapter is, and this was alluded to at the top of this call, is that moment where Google identifies photos posted by a software engineer in Brooklyn as gorillas, right? That's 2015. We are still struggling to deal with that issue, right? Years after Meg said that in the pages of Bloomberg, years after that incident, even though you have people like Meg and Timnit Gebru and so many others who have not only noticed this problem, but really called attention to it. The fundamental thing to realize is that it's endemic to the technology, right? The technology has to be built in this way if it's going to work the way, say, these large companies want it to. It requires enormous amounts of data. And what that means is you can't just remove those flaws, right? You can try to start over, but how do you get the data that doesn't have those flaws in it? That's such a difficult thing, and it exemplifies this moment we're going through now, not only at Google and Microsoft, but the tech industry as a whole, where it's struggling to deal with that conundrum.
A couple of years ago, I had a conversation about this with Kate Crawford, and she mentioned that we have this bias to think about machines as being infallible, and what they say goes, because how could a machine make a mistake? But I think what you pointed out is really thoughtful, because in a way the machines are just really an extension of us, right? And we come with our own biases, all of us. How are people starting to think more about that since that 2015 quote? And probably even before that, people were speaking out about it.
No, they are. The good news is they are thinking about it more, but there are these other forces. And what is so interesting to me is that you do have this moment in my book where Timnit and Meg really call attention to this. They are both hired by Google, and led by Meg, they create this ethical AI team at Google, which is designed to fight this problem. Recently, since my book was put to bed, they have both been ousted from Google. And I've written about this in the pages of the Times. As you have on the one side, people calling attention to this, and a lot of people taking notice, inside companies as well as out, you have these other corporate forces in various ways pushing against it, right? These companies have their own aims. Companies are complicated, and driven by the profit motive, among other things. It often comes into conflict with these other efforts.
I find that so interesting, because their ideas are powerful, insightful, important, much like neural networks were, right? But like neural networks were before they were adopted by Amazon, Facebook, and Google, their ideas are maligned.
You're exactly right, and it's interesting. You see on Twitter, for instance, on a daily basis, people accusing, say, Timnit of being an activist, which really raises my hackles, right? You can make, and you see this in the book, the same criticism of these neural network pioneers, who are sort of in the wilderness, saying that this technology is going to work when most of the industry thinks it won't, right? You could deride them as an activist, right? These are all scientists. Timnit, I think you make a great analogy, right? In the face of pushback from all these people around her, she's saying, you need to pay attention to this. Thankfully, she's not alone.
Why do you think the industry is having a hard time with that?
Well, change is hard. For one thing. The other thing is that, the companies are designed in certain ways. And this is another interesting thing you see in the book, is that these companies develop these individual personalities almost, and they respond to situations differently and in particular ways that are informed by their history, but also companies are designed to promote themselves, right? And to tell the world that what they are doing is positive. And even if they, on one level acknowledge the problems in the world, they don't want those problems to be on them. And that's sort of at the heart of the clash, say, between Google and Tim Need and Meg, is that they tried to publish a paper that called attention to some of these problems. Well, Google didn't want Google's name on that, right? Is part of the issue there. And again, this is not just a Google problem. This is something that all these companies are going to have to deal with.
From your reporting, this is an audience question. Is there a way to correct the biases in AI?
It's very, very hard. I mean, like I said, it's endemic to the technology. So if you take these systems, these natural language systems, literally, they spend months analyzing text from the internet. Months. And we're talking about thousands of books and thousands of articles and blog posts and computer programs and everything. It works because of volume, right? It works because you want to throw as much at it as you can. And what that means is you can't just weed out all the stuff that might be problematic. And the industry and science as a whole are still struggling with, well, how do we deal with that? Right now, you sort of have to put Band-Aids on it after the fact, right? You have to put filters on it. That's not always ideal. People have talked about, can we develop synthetic data, so to speak, that can train these in other ways? But that's still an open question as well. Technically, it's such a hard problem.
There's a scene in the book, just trying to find it, but I can't. So I'll just recollect from memory.
Yeah.
In Clarify, where a woman is trying to understand why the data doesn't work. Can you walk us through that scene?
This is Deb Raji, who was at Clarify, a startup in New York. And they're trying to build an image recognition system and a content moderation system. She herself is a Black woman from Ottawa. And so to her, the problem is obvious. The company has taken all these stock photos, which have been floating around the internet for ages, and used them to train the system. Well, almost all the photos, or a majority of the photos, were of white men, right? So when she sees that, right, that is immediately, obvious to her that's a problem. But it's not necessarily obvious to others, right? And that's part of what we're dealing with here. The question of diversity in the tech industry has obviously been a problem for a while. In this field, there's an added level to that problem, right? In that we have people who are choosing the data, right? Me as a white man, I have a certain perspective on the world, and that's going to inform the data I choose. That's one of the reasons we really need a diverse population of people working on this, so they can see these issues in the way that Deb could see them, right? It was completely obvious to her.
You mentioned that Team Neat and Meg were ousted from Google. There was a different scenario there around Project Maven. Can you talk about that? And also, what struck me was that the two of the people that got let go in the wake of that were also women.
It's true. And this is the military project that I, mentioned earlier with Jeff Hinton, right? So Google started working with the Department of Defense on image recognition for drone footage. That can have a lot of uses, including surveillance, as well as autonomous weapons, potentially, right? If it's a way to identify targets. And that was a real concern to people. I think there are a lot of echoes here, with the situation involving bias, right? So many of the people who protested that, many of whom, you're right, are women, are no longer with the company, right? So Google is a company that this is the way its personality sometimes exerts itself. Google's a company where, at least in the early years, the employees were encouraged to speak their minds, right? And push back when they wanted to push back. And that's one of the reasons you've seen these protests at Google kind of bubble over into the public sphere in ways they haven't in other companies. But Google is also a public company, and they've really pushed back against this. Although they did pull out of Project Maven, they ended up pushing out a lot of the people who protested it. Right there is a pattern here in this respect, even though that's a very different situation technically.
An audience question here related to government and AI. At present, governments are using AI for surveillance and defense tech. What should be a government role in bringing AI to society in a healthy manner?
Yeah, I do think that these are issues that we have to deal with as a society as a whole, right? That means the tech companies, that means individuals, but that means government as well. And we're starting to see government at least wake up to these ideas. Like even the DoD, has laid down what they call ethical guidelines for the use of this type of technology. But we need to keep thinking about this, right? I need to keep writing about it, and you do too. And as a society, we need to, keep looking for what is really happening. It's easy to say, and we've seen this from government agencies, from companies, easy to say, we're thinking about it, right? It's easy to say we have a framework in place. How much teeth does that framework have though, right? How much is it really going to do? And when push comes to shove, is it really going to affect things? These are all questions that we all have to deal with, and they're only going to become more important.
How do you audit an AI system? Whereas you mentioned earlier, sometimes you don't even understand what goes in and then the answers that come out.
There's a lot of disagreement on this. Part of the problem is when it comes to dealing with the bias problem, we don't have the data we need to really audit it. Ultimately, at this point, what it's about is really testing the system, right? Seeing where it works and where it doesn't. That's not always the way internet technology has worked, right? It's more about getting it out into the world and patching it after the fact. But the way these systems are built now, the way to really audit it is to really test it, see where it goes wrong, and fix those flaws. That's a hard thing to do, but that's really what needs to be done nowadays.
Another related question from an audience member. What is the importance of model interpretability? And do you see this subfield growing in importance in the future?
I think it's a really interesting field. So this is the idea that, we've got this giant neural network. It trains on all this internet data. Can we develop tools that allow us to really understand what it has learned? I think, again, that's a really interesting area of research. And you see this in academia, you see it in industry. There are a lot of people who are working on this, and there are some things that can be learned. At the same time, these neural networks are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're taking in more and more data, and it's becoming harder to understand what they're learning. I don't know how you ever get there. I mean, fundamentally, these machines are learning at a scale that we as humans cannot. I mean, full stop, right? I mean, that is just the reality of it. That's why these machines are powerful, is that they can learn from more data than we could ever learn from. They can learn from these skills to a level that you could never hard code all the behavior in as an engineer, right? So I think that although interesting, that's not something that is going to pay off anytime soon, if ever, right? We really need to realize that.
You mentioned that AI is outpacing the way that we learn. Do you want to caveat that? A baby will learn words quicker, or how to handle something with their hands or walk. Robots are falling over themselves all the time.
Well, you're exactly right. There are some ways that machines are superior to us and have been for a long time, and we keep developing new ways they are superior. But these are niche areas. The machine is not good at so many things that we are still good at. So yes, a machine can analyze thousands of cat photos, right, and pinpoint all those patterns that we could never define on our own. But they're not good at reasoning, and they're not good at just picking things up in a moment, like even a baby can. It's a great point to make.
Human intelligence also has a lot to do with emotion. Though sometimes what we learn, how we learn it, how fast we acquire that knowledge or forget it, really depends on human emotions, right? And so, from an audience question, again, human intelligence is suffused with human emotions, such as a drive to win or a sense of compassion. Are there artificial machine equivalents to emotion, whether intended or not? And then added on my own question, how would that help or hurt the quest for artificial intelligence that's better?
Well, what I often say is that we tend to see emotion sometimes in machines, right? They'll exhibit a little piece of behavior, and that will elicit something in us that reminds us of what we see in humans. We tend to project those emotions on the machines, but machines don't feel that, so to speak, among their many other flaws. And there are efforts to kind of recreate that, but that's also hard to do. What I will say though is that I think we need to understand the way that these machines are affected by our own emotions, right? Again, this is not just building technology for technology's sake. We need to think about how that affects us emotionally, how it affects us historically. There are so many things to consider when it comes to building these machines. Will it help if they have emotions? I don't know. That could create its own problems, and probably will.
How has your own relationship with technology changed since you've been covering this so deeply?
Well, what I try to bring to my reporting, and even to the book as well, is a healthy skepticism and an objectivity. A story I often tell is, as I said, to you earlier, my father was an engineer at IBM, and one of the things he worked on was the universal product code, the barcode that's on all your groceries, and it's something everybody can relate to. And he had these amazing stories about the creation of the technology. It was technically interesting how they did this, but then he also had this great story about when they actually deployed it, and something happened that they didn't expect. They put this in grocery stores, and there were literally protests on the sidewalks because people thought this was the sign of the beast, come true from the Bible and the book of Revelations, right? It was a really instructional moment for me, right? You have on one side this technology that is built in this fascinating way and reaches this point where it can do things that you didn't expect technically. Then you put it out into the world, and then it really does things that you didn't expect as it interacts with people's emotions, like we talked about earlier, and history, right? And literature. These are all things that we need to consider. And as I have written the book, and as I developed this beat at the Times, I have to constantly remind myself of that, and constantly say, what am I forgetting about where this could go? Is the person who's talking to me now, do they have the full picture? Don't I need to talk to someone else and see what their perspective is? And that's what it's about. It's about constantly widening your net to new people who understand new things about the technology, but also about the world in general and how that technology is going to affect that world.
That's interesting that you bring that up because, we were talking about Facebook earlier, and a lot of the technology on that platform and others is about personalization. So we become these beings in our own bubbles where we don't talk to people who don't share the same values or the same ideas. How is AI amplifying that, and what are the consequences for the future?
It's another great point, and I'm actually writing a piece about this, at the moment, because you do see this in our daily lives when you use these services. They're designed to give you what you want, right? Whether it's a social network or a chat bot. I wrote another story about during quarantine about these chat bots, which are using these AI systems, these natural language systems that we've talked about at length there, to learn to carry on a conversation. And that's a powerful thing at this moment, when we need, interaction, right? And people are starting to use that. And what the system does, and the reason people respond to it, is that it sort of gives them what they want, right? It's telling them positive things, and that's what people respond to. But in our relationships, we need both positive reinforcement and the negative, right? We need to be taken out of those bubbles. How is technology going to do that? We know whether it's a social network or it's a chat bot. Like, how do you get people to use a chat bot who's going to be like a good sibling, right? And who's going to point out, my sisters did this, point out your flaws, tell you, where you need to be better, right? That's an important part of our lives, whether it's, a sibling or a therapist. You don't need someone only telling you the good things. You don't, want people in your lives only creating that bubble for you. How do we step out of that?
Are there people who are working on that problem to give you a balanced look as opposed to the very personalized outlook?
In all these areas, again, people are at least recognizing the problem. And as I wrote about that chatbot, for instance, I talked to experts in all sorts of fields, in therapy, in technology. Sherry Turkle, who's well known in this field, like she is adamant about this, like these sorts of therapy bots that are only reinforcing what you already think, only giving you the positive. We need to step back and think about this. Luckily, there are people like Sherry at least calling attention to it.
In your conversations with people over the last year in quarantine, has that experience of being isolated and where maybe technology is part of the solution but not the entire story, has that changed, like the focus areas that you're talking about with people that are getting them excited? What has been the effect of this on this field?
The effect is huge, right? And I think about it a lot as I put together stories. I think we all need to think about this, right? And I think about this as I raise my two daughters, and you see them rely on technology more and more. And there's some things that are incredibly positive. Like, I have a 13-year-old daughter who has actually developed some of her relationships to an entirely new level through FaceTime. Like, she will live on FaceTime with her cousin, on another coast. And that's been a real positive thing. You can see it. But, in the long term, this can also drag us down, and we can rely on technology as a crutch in a way that maybe we shouldn't. And it can be easy to stay at home and do Zoom like this. It's easier to be a reporter, right? To get on Zoom, but the better stories come, right? The better questions come. You find new things when you get out into the world, right? And it's true not just to journalists, anyone else. There are those things that I think we all need. Now, it might be easier to say, if you're a company, things are working well with everybody at home, let's just keep it that way. Maybe that's not the best thing. I am hoping that as much as possible, we can get back to a world, where, I am meeting people on the street, others are going back to the office, for all these very human reasons that we've talked about.
How did you come to choose the main characters in the book?
Well, what I eventually realized that there was this common thread with Jeff, and that there was this tiny circle around him. And what I became fascinated by was that this idea at various stages of a neural network was so strange, even in the AI field, that there weren't a lot of people who believed in it. And so that circle is teeny tiny, and that makes for a really good story on two levels, right? One like fundamental good story historically is someone who believes in something even in the face of skepticism, right? But then also you had this tiny group whose paths would cross each other in these really surprising ways. There were these moments when I was doing the reporting, for instance, when I realized that Demis Hassabis, who created DeepMind, came out of this program at the University College London called the Gatsby Unit, which is kind of this blend of neuroscience and AI. Well, the Gatsby Unit was founded by Jeff Hinton, right? And there were all these moments that I discovered in my reporting where Jeff was there, right? A lot of people talk about the moment when he and two students really showed that image recognition could work through this idea in 2012. Well, Jeff, 2 years earlier, had been instrumental in making this idea work with speech recognition in a completely different part of the world. He was at Microsoft. And there's this great story in the book about him traveling by train because he doesn't sit down, to Microsoft to make this work. And then on top of all that, this tiny group suddenly became enormously valuable when the idea started to work. And you see this in the opening of the book when Jeff literally auctions his services off to the highest bidder, and there are all these companies bidding for him. And it set the price for the talent. So you had this tiny group of people, and each, they are people. They're interested in their own particular ways, and then they're suddenly in demand, and they move into these companies. So that became sort of the center of the book, right? This tiny group who then moved into industry, and that's going to leave out a lot of interesting and important people, but that's part of any story that you do, any book that you write.
In looking back at the history, Jeff certainly is the hub of this network. I had the chance to sit in at one of their workshops before the big NeurIPS, formerly called NIPS conference. And one of the things that I noticed at the time, I think this was 2012, maybe 13, was it was all guys. And the one woman who was part of the group actually wasn't there. I don't know why. How does that trickle down to now?
Well, talk about the sea of dudes problem, right? And you walk into a room like that, and we were actually working together. I remember when you wrote the story, right? And you can see that, and you can see that historically, right? All these people that we're talking about, the people who are instrumental, the people who are in that room when you're visiting that meeting, are the people who built this technology. It's a tiny group, and they built it. And so that is the fundamental problem that is there as the technology starts to work. And then you have people like Timnit Gebru. There's a scene in the book, which is similar to your experience. She walks into the NeurIPS conference and sees, it's hundreds of people, like you've seen this too, who are there for a lecture. and she realizes that there is no one who looks like her. That she's, out of hundreds of people, she counted 5 Black people, and they were all men, right? All of whom she knew. And this is a conference. It's not in the U.S. It's in Barcelona, right? This is a global community that we're talking about, and this issue is in many ways global.
I remember a story that you assigned me when we were working together at Wired to do an interview with Rushi Sangvi, who was one of the first employees at Facebook. And she said that she came to technology with the idea that it was a meritocracy and found out that it wasn't. Is that still playing out today?
Oh, it's absolutely playing out. And, you see it time and again, with the situation at Google and Tim Neat. And what I think is positive, though, is that people are more willing to call it out, right? What you and I saw firsthand is it was often so hard to convince people to call it out, right? There were consequences. There still are for people who are willing to, obviously still are, for people who are willing to say the obvious. So on some level, we've seen some progress because people, are willing to stand up and say, we need to think about this. And, that is so hard to do, but we're starting to see that. What we also need to do is listen when that happens, right? And that can be hard too, right? You have to be willing to, willing again to put yourself in uncomfortable situations. Me as a reporter and as a white man, I need to listen, when those moments come up, and when people are critical of, say the way I'm doing things, or I'm building a story. That's one thing that I've learned is, you have a certain way of doing things, and you have to be willing to be challenged on that, even if there are really good reasons why you do things and why you build technology or you build a story. You have to be willing to step back over and over and over again and say, is there something else I need to think about?
How do you want people to remember your book?
Well, what I wanted to do, and there came a moment in the middle of it when I thought, wow, this is a really bad idea. This is never going to happen. It's like build, a book that told the definitive story of this moment in time. What has happened, on so many different levels. And that means roping in so many of the things we've talked about, right? The development of the idea, and then all the areas where it started to work. And that's what's fascinating. This single idea is driving the change in area after area after area. And I wanted to, through the people, have it read like a novel, show all that, but then show all these questions that it has raised. The bias question, the autonomous weapons question. The big question we haven't talked about is the disinformation question. These systems, and this is the other huge problem that we are going to face, is these systems can generate images, videos, blog posts, tweets, as well as conversations that look like the real thing. And if we think we have a disinformation problem now, once those machines perfect that, or once we build machines that can do that 100% of the time, we have to change the way we look at the world. And then there are all the geopolitical issues, right? This is a global thing. It's not an American thing. All the talent was outside the US. And a lot of the US
immigrants.
Right. They're all immigrants. The US companies jumped on it. But by the way, in that scene at the beginning of the book where Jeff Hinton auctions himself off the highest bidder, there is a Chinese player right then. Like, people think that China followed, they were right there. And right, there are all these geopolitical issues to consider. Like, my aim was to rope all that into one book and kind of level set us for everything to come. This is what has happened. These are the questions that we're facing, including that big AGI question, what people say they're working on. How should we think about that? That's what I wanted to do. So hopefully, like, it's a good read for people who want, a human story. But hopefully I can layer the bigger ideas on top of all that.
Yeah, can we talk about AI, like outside of the US? We've been very US focused here. How is it playing out in China, in Asia, in Europe? Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. One of the things I'm fascinated by, and maybe this is surprising to some people, Jeff Hinton was an academic, right? He was a professor at the University of Toronto. And when he moved into Google, one of the stipulations is he wanted to keep his professorship, and he wanted to keep behaving like an academic. And you saw this with, one of his old colleagues, Jan LeCun, who followed him. Jan went to Facebook, and Jan followed Jeff's lead. He wanted to be able to publish, right? And Jan talks about this a lot. And what happened was, remarkably, right, the sensibilities of these few individuals changed the course of these companies. And what you saw at Google and Facebook and others is that they publish all their latest research, right? So the latest ideas get shared with everyone. What that means is they're available to everyone, whether you're in London or you're in China, right? The latest research is freely available. And the currency becomes who has the data, right, to train these systems, and who has the processing power to train the systems, and who has the talent. In some ways, a lot of people think China has the advantage there. They have a huge population. That means they're going to create more data. In theory, they're going to create more talented AI researchers, right, who can build these systems, right? And that's really what's important there. So you have this new landscape that you have to think about differently, right? This is not a 1950s Cold War landscape. We need to, not think about this in terms of, export controls or, sealing off our borders to certain immigrants. Absolutely, it's not that kind of world. We as the US are relying on immigrant talent. We always have. That includes Chinese talent, right? If we say bar our borders to Chinese AI researchers, we are shooting ourselves in the foot. At the same time, we try to right, exactly. And if we, set export controls, so we're not exporting anything to China, what is that going to do? They have access to all the research papers, right? So we need to think about this world differently. Certainly, we need to worry about espionage from other countries. There are concerns, particularly when it comes to military applications and the like. But this is not the world of absolutes that people might have thought our world was in the past.
Some of the going back to the misinformation that you mentioned a bit ago, before it played out here, it played out elsewhere. In the Philippines, for example. Are there things happening outside our borders that are powered by AI that we should keep an eye on to see where we are going in the future?
Absolutely. Like the prime example is in China, where this technology, right, a neural network, which can identify faces in photos, among so many other things, is being used to target an ethnic minority, right? That's the type of thing that really raises concerns in this area, all right? This same type of technology is being deployed here in the States. And luckily, we're starting to raise questions about it, right? China is this extreme example, but as you indicate, right, as we see this play out in extreme ways, as we see it play out outside our borders, we need to think about how we are going to deploy these things, how we were already starting to. And you see this in my book, where there starts to be a rollout of face recognition technology. And really, because of people like Tim Neat, these companies start to wake up to it. And some of them start to respond and at least say, we need to think about legislation. As usual, these companies only go so far, but at least they're publicly recognizing these types of issues. I think you're exactly right. We live in a world where this technology is developed everywhere and deployed everywhere. We can't think of what we're doing solely within our borders.
We are also doing that here, right? A company that doesn't come up in the book is Palantir, but their technology has been used for years to track undocumented immigrants.
That's exactly right. And again, that's another example of, you might call Palantir's technology simpler, right? It's not this sort of AI we're talking about, but it's often about, the way these things are deployed. And then, as the technology becomes more powerful, that those very issues become bigger and bigger.
What can private citizens do if they're worried about the use of AI by their local police department or local government?
Well, I think one of the lessons here, and I said this earlier, is that these are problems that we all need to deal with, right? It's not, the companies aren't going to deal with on their own. We know that. The governments aren't going to deal with it on their own. They, and their interests often blend with the interests of the companies as well. And particularly, if we have these situations where, the corporations are pushing people out who are calling attention to this, that becomes, our problem, right? We need to individually, speak up about this. Journalists need to write about it, but also people need to call attention to it.
Often the problems that AI causes affect groups that are disenfranchised or marginalized already. And so the problems that it causes may seem like they're at an arm's reach, far away for someone else. Why should people like you and me who are privileged care about that?
Well, again, we all have to step outside of our bubbles, right? And realize it's easy in Silicon Valley to forget everything else that is going on. It's easy to only look at what is happening in your bubble. We need to remember that these are not technologies just for the privileged. These are technologies that are creeping into the daily lives of everyone, sometimes in unexpected ways. We absolutely have to keep an eye on that.
This is one of the things that I actually really appreciated about the book, that in a way it was a history of this community, but also a story of us.
Absolutely. What I often say, is that any good story is about people, right? And that includes technology, right? And technology writing doesn't always work that way, but fundamentally what I wanted to do was tell a story about people. And then if I could do that, build all these bigger ideas on top of that.
If you were going to write a sequel in 10 years, what do you think you'd be writing about? Is it going to be neural networks again, or is there another technology that's looming, a new community of eccentrics that are going to push us forward even more?
Well, we'll see. My inclination is always to do something completely different. So I may surprise you, but I don't know one of the things I've been thinking about is quantum computing, which is another fascinating area which is coming to the fore. We'll see there. But this story, the AI story, it's really only just beginning, right? And we're still only just understanding how these systems work and how they're being deployed. I think there's so much left to cover, and certainly I'll keep covering it at the times.
There's a lot of high-flying stories in your book, some quite literally. Can you talk about that particular story, and then we can move on to your word after that?
That's a good place to end, because we go back to Jeff Hinton, right? So you do learn in the first sentence of the book that he has this back problem. He literally does not sit down. He as a teenager, he was lifting a space heater for his mother, and he slipped a disc. And so by his late 50s, the disc would slip so often that it was hard for him to function. Like, there are all these stories from his students where they would walk into his office and he's laid out on the desk and they're trying to defend their PhD thesis. And, he's either on his desk or on a cot by the wall. But what that meant was he does not drive and he does not fly, because the commercial airlines make you sit during takeoff and landing. And this is another moment that I was just floored by as it came up in my research, that Jeff had moved to Google, and Google's thinking about acquiring DeepMind, and they want Jeff to go to London to vet the company and help them decide if they're going to spend what ended up being $650 million on this company. And he says, well, I don't fly. Well, Alan Eustace, who was the head of engineering, devised this incredible contraption, which was inspired by his own feats as a skydiver, like an extreme skydiver, to basically strap Jeff in place on this makeshift bed in a Gulfstream jet. And this is how Jeff, made it to London and ended up walking into the offices of DeepMind.
That's pretty wild. Who told you that story?
Well, one of the great things and the very hard things about, our job is that, you do it piece by piece, right? You get a little hint that this has happened, and then you go to the next person and you get a little bit more. And then once you've got enough, then you can go to the source and you say, well, I've got this much, you might as well tell me the rest, right? And, and that's the way the book often worked.
We just, to follow up on DeepMind here, one of your numbers was 44 for the 44 million that Google paid for Jeff and his two students. That seemed like a crazy number at the time, but in retrospect, with not even 2 years, I think that would seem like a bargain basement deal, given how much was paid for DeepMind. Why the huge explosion in the price for this talent? One researcher you talked to, I think, likened it to acquiring an NFL quarterback.
Right. That, by the way, the $44 million figure that Jeff and his two sisters were acquired for, that was the hardest thing to pinpoint in the book. Like, I was worried I wouldn't be able to to back that up, but that's how much they paid. And you're right, it ended up being a bargain price. That's $44 million for 3 people, right? And so individually, that's a whole lot of money. But then the prices would explode. And it's basically supply and demand, right? There's this tiny group of people who specialize in this field. And we can argue about whether or not the companies behave rationally or not, but they were all intent on jumping on this area. And that meant the prices went sky high, right? Everyone wanted their own Jeff Hinton, right? And you see this, most interestingly with Microsoft, where Facebook had LeCun and Google had Hinton, and they wanted their own. And this incredible guy we haven't talked about named Chi Lu, who's one of the top executives, ends up going to Montreal to try to get their own. But you just had this frenzy, and when that happens, there are these moments. It may happen in other areas soon where the price just suddenly skyrockets for the talent.
Is that still on the up?
Well,
for the engineers looking for jobs on this call,
it's still a field where you can command a lot of money, right? And this is, because it bleeds into these other areas, self-driving cars, for instance, self-flying drones, which are, becoming big. It's definitely an area that the people who are, are looking for a career should look at, right? These are skills that are in demand, and it is a change in the way we think about technology and the way technology is built.
Anything that you left out of the book because just there wasn't the space for it that you wish had gotten in?
Well, I often say that, that everything is in there, and it pretty much is. Unfortunately, there's one great anecdote that I just cannot share. Sometimes that's just the way it works. One anecdote that I wish was in there, which I think is interesting because it parallels this whole story. Fei Li, who is a professor at Stanford,
One of the women embroiled in the Maven.
Exactly. So she's in the book, but one anecdote that people don't realize, which I think is really powerful. In order for neural networks to work, we talked about this. You needed the data, you need the processing power. Well, Jeff Hinton and his two students who were bought for $44 million, they had this key result on a contest called ImageNet. And ImageNet, is a collection of photos, right, that allowed them to build a system that could recognize everything in those photos. And that was, the brainchild of Fei. And, I was talking at one point to her and, ended up talking to her advisor as well. And there was this moment between them where, Fei says, I want to do ImageNet. Basically she wanted to bet her career on this idea. And he told her that was not the way to go, that she should not do it. That wasn't the thing to bet her career on. And she did it anyway, right? And that's another piece that had to be in place for this type of thing to work.
Why isn't that in the book? Like it's such a powerful thing that drove all the men's success.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's complicated, but I wish it was in there, right? And sometimes you make choices for narrative and for flow. So you make these hard decisions. But, again, we need to step back and think about those decisions we've made, right? Whoever we are, and rethink them and say, did I make a mistake there? Does that need to go in the next time? Or that type of thing to go in the next time.
How, an audience question here about your process. How quickly did you write the book and what have you learned from the writing process?
I wrote it over the course of about 2.5, 3 years. I made the mistake of agreeing to write a book and agreeing to join the New York Times on the same week. Never ever do that. That's a mistake. You end up making your life far too complicated. What I have learned is the next time I'm taking a book leave, and I'm going to concentrate on the book rather than trying to do it in the mornings and late at night and standing in line at the grocery store while thumbing through Google Docs on my phone. That's not the way to go. So
you learn more about the actual taking time off to write your project rather than doing it as part of your full-time job. Well, I mean, I think you also, in writing a book, you learn more about your field. And I think you also learn more about the ways that we tell stories, and the way you give people a real idea of what's going on. It's a different skill, from daily reporting, and I've learned a lot about the arc of things, and like I said, you also make choices that that you regret, and you try to learn from that in the future. I think that's a perfect segue into the Computer History Museum's one-word initiative. So you were asked to write a single word down that would give a young person some advice. And I know that it's a very personal word to you. Can you show us what that word is and tell us the story behind it? Absolutely. This is going to go back to my father again.
who was an engineer at IBM, but an amateur philosopher. My word is truth. And there's some symbols below, which I'll explain. My father, he loved this philosopher named Mortimer J. Adler, who wrote this book called 6 Great Ideas. It was about many of the ideas that you should live your life by. And my father always talked about, and he would echo this book, that there were 3 ideas that you should strive for in your daily life: truth, goodness, and beauty. And he believed this to the point where he put symbols for each of these ideas on keepsake boxes made of oak for all his grandchildren. And he firmly believed that this is the way that you should live, and truth was the most important. And he would represent truth with the Pythagorean theorem, this symbol that was meant to illustrate the Pythagorean theorem. So truth, goodness, the heart, beauty was the rose. And truth was so important because it informed what we understood to be goodness and beauty. To understand those concepts, you need to understand what is true. And truth is something that you do have to struggle with every day. I certainly struggle with it as a reporter. It's about constantly talking to new people and reevaluating what you've heard the previous day, and taking in what you're hearing from everyone, and then sitting down at the end of the day and thinking, what do I believe is true, given everything that I've learned, giving everyone I've talked to? It's a personal decision, but it's informed by everyone you speak to on a daily basis.
That's great. And you dedicate the book to your dad.
Absolutely. He died a few years ago. So what I often say is, like, the one person who would enjoy the book most isn't around to read it. That's the one thing that makes me sad. But otherwise, I really think that this embodies the book in many ways, a lot of the things that he stood for, right? He was an engineer, but he believed in those bigger ideas. And he often raised those concerns that we've talked about how technology can affect our world in ways that we might not expect.
I think we'll leave it at that. I don't want to go on into the more awesome conversation here. So excuse me. I'm going to turn it back to Daniel. And thank you so much, Kate, for inviting me to do this. It's been a pleasure to talk to you about the book. And I hope it's very successful.
Thank you for doing this. A lot of fun.
Daniel, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Danielle. Okay, this is a terrific conversation. Absolutely on point as we think about how technology is redefining what it means to be human and changing how we interact with one another and, frankly, the planet. CHM, for the last 4 decades, has established itself to be the premier institution and trusted source for preserving and communicating the history of computing and its impact on the human experience. And while we serve a diverse array of audiences, the key point here is these live events are a vital part of our public education and conversations that help all of us become better citizens in the modern world where technology is ever present. These conversations are preserved and available full-length video on the YouTube channel, but also key takeaways have been parsed and will be available on our website. And they are preserved as a permanent part of our collection and for publication and research and exhibits and ongoing education. So in quick summary, it's a beautiful thing to be able to think about history because everything has it. And as one of our previous guests pointed out, and he was a noted historian, it's an imperfect but indispensable guide to the future and the only mirror and measuring rod that we have for the present. So thank you, Kate and Danielle. It was a great conversation about the way the world is today with AI, and we'll be back in a few years to readjust. Thanks so much. Bye-bye, everyone.